who got your logs, why my car is, vulnerable to, I don't know, bombing sprees.
Mario, if I can just synthesize what I understood here is that you're suggesting that the products in many ways are solving a smaller portion of the threat landscape than maybe many enterprises think they are solving. Mm-hmm. Is that essentially your point as well?
What I'm hearing him say is, obviously defense in depth is a big deal, but I guess, I bet you most non-sophisticated users, even corporations, assume that, exploit, malware, give me a break, it's all stuff your product should be catching.
And that's certainly how the products are marketed. And that's how the products are marketed, yeah. That's not, and that's part of the problem. The marketing is gotten way ahead of products' capabilities.
I'm shocked to hear you say that. Yeah. We have a question from the back.
This is very interesting. I hear this. I'm in the IT industry. I'm on a number of lists with what I know are sophisticated IT administrators, and a lot of them don't even get it because they quote, like recently this topic came up and they're quoting, well, this AV product done on the virus 100. The reality is that they're only testing, they're on the 100, but they're only testing for 20% of the stuff out there. So even the enterprises think if they make some of these lists, it's a great product.
And the stuff doesn't include the category of exploits and all the other. So let me redirect this back to the question and segue just a second here. So we've talked about that we've got issues with what the products are being used to solve, and by extension what we're testing. So you kind of slagged VB100 a couple minutes ago. Let's talk about what's wrong with VB100 and the wild list and some of these other methodologies. What's the problem, and what do you propose to do that's better?
Well, I'll start with the wild list because it's just such an easy target. Oh, sorry. I'll start with the wild list because it's such an easy target. So the malware that is in the wild list is provided by vendors. So of course they're going to do well, and they share it with one another. So it's sort of like, okay, here's the questions that are going to be on the test, and here are the answers. Now learn them and then come into my lab. So if you're not getting 100%, frankly, you're an idiot. All right. So, and it's the same thing with, I'll say the VB100. I'm going to pick on ICSA. When you tell people and take the approach of, memorize the answers. Here's the questions. And that's why you can say on certain tests, we don't certify people who don't get 100%. Like that's, when you see people make those kind of claims, it means that, their testing is fundamentally flawed. And it's, and that's, right? I mean, would you agree with that, Peter?
Yeah, full.
Yeah.
It's true.
How about the VB100?
Effectively the same thing. I mean, the entire process served well, when it was invented. I mean, really have to start saying, looking at that wild. I don't even. Do we have it on some slide? Maybe it's on here when the wild list was invented. I don't know. It has over 10 years to it. It was the threat landscape was different, products were different. We were using computers in a much different way than we do today. And at that time, it was simply, let's vendors get together and at least see what are the relevant threats in the wild, because people, there was not that many samples as we have today. So there was a fair amount of inventing your own samples for whatever testing, detection purposes, marketing purposes. Nowadays, you could spin the story whichever way you want to, just based out of the on the live samples. Now the samples were limited to whatever was common among vendors, shared. It didn't include everything. This was only a subset of things, just so we could actually talk about what type of threats we see in the wild. Are we serving the user base? That was the problem from 10 years ago, and this process definitely sort of the relic. It's statistically insignificant. It's tiny percentage of samples that we see out there. They're definitely not fresh because they had to have been in the wild for a long time for the vendors to agree on their inclusion into the core. But I guess, the only value you can see that is the sort of the stupid argument, meaning like, if you don't detect the wild core samples, then obviously, it's not a serious security organization to begin with.
That's one part where we are collecting our samples. We got some samples from vendors too, but after each test, we get the question from all vendors, where have you seen those samples which you're providing to us? Because we are using about 60 honeypots worldwide to collect samples. So we have about 3 honeypots only in China, 10 honeypots in Asia, and we have, since I think 2 weeks, 1 honeypot in Africa. And these are samples we won't get anywhere, so we have to do an infrastructure to catch samples by our own. That's one of the important things. And for the new tests, with the whole product test, it's getting much more harder to collect samples. We're getting about 40 to 50,000 samples a day, not fresh samples, but only samples, not uniques. But it's much work to sort these samples.
Yeah.
That's the big issue we have, to sort samples. 40,000 samples a day, you cannot do this manual, but you have to do this manual at the last part of the stage. So we use automatization also for sorting the samples, and after this we try to investigate each samples manually. After sorting manually. And this is one of the big deals where testers have to get samples. And it's not easy to use about 60 honeypots. So also in this way we are working with the university.
So if I can just summarize what I thought I heard there, it's really at least 2 problems. The first is that the existing tests are canned.
Yep.
The wild list might be called the caged list,
Yep.
if one were being honest.
Yep.
And the sheer number of samples that everybody is seeing, and the numbers you mentioned, Peter, are very similar to what the vendors say they are seeing every day, tens of thousands.
Yeah, so from a
So these 2 things, just the sheer scale of it and the nature of the tests being somewhat rigged.
Well, so to give you an idea, the way that, from a volume perspective, we are now, as of yesterday, we are now getting over 10 million URLs per hour. Okay, we don't know which of those 10 million are bad. These are early suspicious, possibly. Now, no AV vendor can take those 10 million and just say, oh, I'm going to block all these, because 99% of them are perfectly valid and there's nothing wrong with them, right? But for us, the good news is, it's a matter of, our perspective is throwing hardware at the problem, right? Automating the problem, and basically if we can go to, hundreds of thousands of URLs, and then at the end of this funnel, if you picture, okay, here's all the stuff that's suspicious, we run the test, and then after the fact we can say, okay, of that 100,000 we ran, here's the 800 that we know are bad, then that's okay, right? But it just means that we're doing a lot more work, and the benefit for us is that we tend to be able to be ahead of the AV vendors, because again, I don't have to know as a tester that it's a bad URL before I test somebody, right? I just have to know that it's suspicious, and then after the fact I find out it's bad. The vendor, before they block something, has to know it's bad, right? So I'm at an advantage compared to the vendor, and that's how we can measure things like time to block and so on, which is actually one of the more critical aspects. Because it's not just what percentage are you getting, it's how quickly. Because if you look at the way campaigns are run, and that's the other thing, is that the way that attacks happen nowadays are not traditional one person. There's campaigns against organizations that happen. They do spam, they do Twitter stuff, they do Facebook, they'll do any number of different ways to get in, and all they need is one way to work, right? But these campaigns tend to go in waves. So catching a campaign while it's active in testing is really important when it comes to seeing how effective an AV product is. Because if an AV product blocks something after the campaign's over, well, who cares? It's not doing anything anymore. It may be a real malware, but the command and control's been shut down and they already harvested everything they wanted to harvest. So there's a whole other issue of time factor that's not taken into account in most tests either. And that's what Peter was talking about, is how quickly these things happen. It's one of the biggest challenges.
Okay. Two questions from the back. Yes.
Okay, I'm going to be sure I understand what you just said.